Hello, my name is Christopher Eames Carpenter. I'm a dual U.S.-Argentine citizen residing in Argentina, and I'm going to get right to the subject. The U.S. Revolution was absolutely not won in the manner most North American school children nor their parents assume. It was won with the support of the French, the Spanish, and others. This amateur lecture, but which is after extensive research and with images I've credited, unfortunately only very loosely here, is focused on the support the Basques gave for the U.S. Revolution, largely the Spanish Basques, a sort of subset within a subset. The Basques had fishing and whaling routes in the region of North America, the northeastern seaboard, going back at least to the mid-1500s and maybe much earlier. This shows Massachusetts, and up to Canada. As a typical North American, I would never have investigated this except I met a descendant of the French Admiral de Grasse in Argentina, which got me to begin to poke about in history. In this lecture, we will see just a bit of how the Spanish worked together, for example, as related to some quick Spanish fundraising in Cuba for de Grasse and Washington at the Battle of Yorktown. Speaking of Argentina and the revolution, according to every book I've read on the subject, Buenos Aires had much to do with the Spanish and French joining forces in a co-enemy relationship against the British, who had attacked the Malvis Falklands Islands in 1770. Apart from settling scores, the pair of kings, Louis XVI for the French and Carlos III for the Spanish, these de Bourbon cousins had vital commercial interests that were hampered by English hegemony, and the English attack at the Malvinas Falklands in 1770 brought a lot to light for these two monarchies to join forces against a common enemy. Though with respect to small land masses in the ocean, nothing compares with the British obsession with Gibraltar and desire to control it. This presentation is a brief series of highlights, predominantly of personalities. More videos may follow, as well as a book on the subject of French and Spanish espionage and commerce in the build-up and winning of the U.S. Revolution. I will not get into all the sums here of the amount of money, nor the amount of troops, nor etc., of what was provided by the Spaniards or particularly the Basques. The point is to begin to show some of the support the Basques provided for the U.S. War for Independence, a successful war that in retrospect would not have happened that way without them. The image here now is of Juan Morales, in whose home George Washington lived in Philadelphia, and who was cared for by Martha Washington when he fell ill. He was born in 1713 in southeast Spain. He is one among the Central Basques we'll delve into, along with Luis Unzaga y Amazaga and Diego de Gardoqui, with whom we'll finish, saving the centerpiece, de Gardoqui, and his relationship with the northern fishermen for last. Although Morales' family is from Béarn, with an ancestral home there in this Basque area located in the Pyrenees Mountains, he is sometimes referred to as Cuban. In fact, his paternal grandfather, Santiago Morales, was secretary to the king in the chancellery in the Kingdom of Navarra, and he arrived in Cuba in 1740. Juan Morales was a business associate with Robert Morris, considered one of the colony's first bankers and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I read that he, along with others, according to the Hispanic Council in one example, raised funds in gold worth $300 million in today's terms and sent the funds to George Washington for his troops. Speaking of money, although there has been some question about whether the symbol for the dollar came from the Spanish flag and the columns there, which look somewhat like today's dollar sign with how the banners pass through the columns, it all seems to boil down to one man, predominantly lost in history, who, though was not Basque, worked with them in financing the United States' soon-to-be successful revolution. Oliver Pollock was his name, and though born in Ireland, he is considered to be from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and his notes for moving money, pesos, as that was a currency of the colonies, believe it or not. Much of the colonies' money was based on the Spanish milled dollar, hence he abbreviated the P and the S to make the dollar sign. This may seem unbelievable, but much and seemingly all, perhaps, of the colonial currency seems to have been based on Spanish money. You see on the screen an image from the U.S. government's currency education program, www.uscurrency.gov, on the evolution, the history of the U.S. symbol design, U.S. dollar symbol design. Here is another image of an actual note from 1780. See the term Spanish milled dollar. Now to our next Basque and friend of Oliver Pollock, Luis de Unzaga y Amezaga. This man, like Pollock, Robert Morris, and the other Basque, Miralles, mentioned first above, was a money man supplying the colonists with help. Incidentally, he is the first cousin of the main protagonist of the story, Diego de Gardoqui, and brother-in-law to Bernardo de Galvez, about whom we have no place to get into at length, but who was given posthumous citizenship by the United States Congress in 2014 for his work helping the colonists struggle for independence. Back to Luis de Unzaga. As mentioned, he supplied money and arms for the colonists, and he was also a Spanish governor of Louisiana from 1769 to 1777, and I understand should be credited with having made what's said to be the first bilingual public school system, French and Spanish, in Louisiana in 1771. He was largely in charge at one point for getting Basque arms moved in various ways from Spain and by way of Venezuela too for the colonists. Now there's a stock certificate for that arms concern on the screen, about which a little more information can be found in the U.S. Library of Congress, for example, and which the Basques are mentioned on a form on that U.S. Library of Congress website. This is a stock certificate for Real Compañía Guipuzcoana de Caracas. Now we can go to the north and to Diego de Gardoqui, the principal protagonist to this story. Diego Maria de Gardoqui, born in Bilbao in 1735, and I think the second son of José de Gardoqui, was never originally a government person, soldier, or the like, though in later years would be appointed to very significant diplomatic posts, but after a meaningful service to his country in commerce and international trade. For example, he was the first ambassador from Spain to the United States. Joseph de Gardoqui and Sons, José de Gardoqui y Hijos in Spanish, that of Diego's father, was apparently a new business created only in the early mid-1700s. At 14, in about 1750, Diego de Gardoqui was sent to London to apprentice for George Haley, a director of the East India Company. As an aside, apparently Alexander Hamilton also apprenticed at about this time, a bit later, at age 14, in the Caribbean for an international trader. As George Haley's apprentice, he was working with a man who later, according to Larry de Ferrero's Brothers at Arms, a Pulitzer-nominated tome on Spanish and French support for the U.S. Revolution, and kind of like a 2,000-page Bible for me, according to Ferrero, Haley later, after the war, bankrolled the export-import businesses of Alexander Hamilton and John Hancock, though I've not been able to corroborate Ferrero's research here. One key to understanding Haley is his relationship with John Wilkes, his brother-in-law, who was a famous pamphleteer, Lord Mayor of the City of London, and could be said an arch-nemesis of King George III, and later a supporter of American independence. Diego de Gardoqui's father, José, was granted permission, I read on material from mountvernon.org dedicated to Washington, to import cod from England and America in 1765, and at some point, the English-trained Diego was put in charge of the buying and selling of goods with the colonists, principally in Marblehead, Beverly, and Salem, Massachusetts. Although I have not seen a transcript of the letter, in late 1774, Jeremiah Lee, one of the prominent fish dealers of the region, along with George Cabot, Robert Hooper, and Elbridge Gerry, Lee, sent a letter to Joseph de Gardoqui and Sons in Bilbao, an urgent request for guns and gunpowder, and to which de Gardoqui replied in February 1775 that he was sending 300 muskets and 600 pairs of pistols. This request would have come before the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and with the arms arriving in July, as mentioned by Elbridge Gerry to James Warren, the President of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and Paymaster General for the Continental Army. This was the first foreign aid received by the American Revolution, according to Mount Vernon. As mentioned in the introduction, the Basques were in this region, for example, from Massachusetts up to Newfoundland since at least the mid-1500s. It could be said here they always were said to have had good relationships with the First Peoples, as the Canadian Museum of History refers to the original Aboriginal people as First Peoples. Now, back to the war which is brewing while we're giving all this background. There were numerous full-scale global wars in the early 1700s, and which England largely won when against the other European powers of France and Spain. These were called the War of Spanish Succession, ending with the treaties of Utrecht in various early teens of the 1700s, the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, ending with the 1763 Treaty of Paris, and with other expensive conflicts thrown in, such as the War of Jenkins' Ear. The English had no intention of bearing the costs of these wars alone, nor solely for the defense of her assets in America, without the colonies paying for them, for this protection, and pay the colonies did. Especially, it might be said, the fishermen, as the sugar plantation owners in the Caribbean, who were largely English and with a strong lobbying presence in London, saw themselves protected, one could say easily, at the fishermen's expense. It should be stated the Caribbean was the center of international trading wealth for Europe at this time. Christopher Magra's The Fisherman's Cause is what brought to light most in full relief for me about what the English exacted on the colonists. The photo you see now is of an Old North church in Marblehead, Massachusetts, the church of which in a prior form in another building had a minister advocate for the men of the town to get involved in fishing as a livelihood for them to make ends meet. I mention this to make the point of how deeply important fishing was for the people of this area. As Christopher Magra pointed out in his book, even back in 1641, to go way back in history again, John Winthrop, a principal governor of Massachusetts Bay, did a tabulation of the importance of Iberia, Spain, as a customer for dried cod from Massachusetts. Magra often refers to how the colonists referred to the good Spanish coin, or Spanish specie, money that could be had from the exportation of dried cod. These clients of codfish, especially in northern Spain, would become absolutely vital for the financial and military support for the U.S. Revolution, as we have seen and shall continue to see. Furthermore, as we have seen, the Spanish as well as the French, although they had commercial ties to the colony, there were also geopolitical reasons for revenge, for the French and Spanish to want to get back at the English for what the French and Spanish monarchies had to withstand and suffer due to treaties and actions following the unsuccessful wars and other conflicts with the British. See the Treaty of Utrecht, which proved especially favorable to the English. Now, really back up to speed, to the colonists of the 1700s and post the treaties of Utrecht and 1763 Treaty of Paris, and to when England exerted her taxing power on the colonists through the use of various acts, which almost killed off fishing, except for maybe the contraband or smuggling. But first see the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Apart from limiting access to fishing with the terms of these treaties, some of the acts were absolutely brutal, even allowing impressment or taking fishermen into a sort of servitude. The northern colonists and their fishing businesses had much less representation in England's Parliament than did the Caribbean sugar plantation owners, and so many of the acts favored the Caribbean sugar growers, as mentioned, many of whom were English. I'll show some images related to the acts now. The acts were horrendously like a noose, and as the Massachusetts historian Samuel Eliot Morison said, pictured here in a photograph taken by my father recently in Boston, Boston lived and thrived by making good use of her access to the sea. The attempt of Parliament to exclude Boston altogether from the element that made her great was a punishment comparable to the destruction of Carthage. Here is an image from a publication called The Proceedings of the American Antiquarian Society of Morrison's article published in 1922, from which I just quoted. Sorry, it's blurry. Indeed, to give an example of how bad things could get, in 1769, a group of Marblehead fishermen needed an attorney, and they found him in the lawyer John Adams, after an English Navy group tried to press the men into naval service, and one of the Marblehead fishermen killed the English lieutenant who was trying to press them. It was a mess in Marblehead Harbor and elsewhere, with the English pushing the colonists around in lots of different ways. According to Magra, Adams succeeded in getting the charges against the Marblehead fisherman dropped on the basis of justifiable homicide and self-defense. Adams argued that Americans had a right to defend their liberty, according to Christopher Magra. The slide here is of a replica of the ship, the HMS Rose, later rechristened, I suppose, or at least renamed, the Surprise, and here she is shown in San Diego. It's a replica of the ship which accosted the Pitt packet in Marblehead Harbor. I've not the slightest idea why a replica of it was made, nor why it is in San Diego. I suppose the ship was used a lot. Christopher Magra did a delightful presentation on this, the Pitt packet affair for children, at the National Maritime Historical Society, featuring another hero of the U.S. Revolution, about whom we won't get into here. To continue. Due to the exertions by the British, contraband, smuggling, developed, as just mentioned, and one of the ugliest facets was the stress on sugar. Sorry, this image is very small. It is of the triangle trade from a post office mural in Medford, Massachusetts. Sugar was not important due only to the contraband issue, but throughout early trader colonial history, most likely. This has to do with industry related to the Caribbean, refuse-grade cod and sugar. The slave trade combined with sugar almost certainly existed extensively prior to the enforcement of British acts against the colonial fishermen, but as sugar trade was favored over the fish trade, it is reasonable to assume, I guess, sugar movement was more plentiful, and as a result, a big rum manufacturing, distilling industry in colonial Massachusetts, in Medford particularly, flourished throughout, and could do so more easily as the sugar trade was not as hampered by the parliamentary restrictions, since the Caribbean plantation owners, sugar people, were largely exempt, again thanks to their strong lobby in London. And this was one of the famous triangle trades, but not often talked about. Refuse-grade cod was sold to Caribbean southern plantation owners to feed their workers in exchange for sugar. I was debating about how to bring this up in this video, produced just after Thanksgiving, and came to the decision to bring it up in an introductory way now, and perhaps for better investigation later, thanks to what I learned from my nephew, my brother and his wife's son, about the mistreatment of native peoples in the Americas during the foundation of the colonies, and then the very clearly evident slavery included in the northeastern colonies later. This all deserves further investigation. Along with Diego de Gardoqui, other Basque fishermen, working with Robert Hooper, George Cabot, Jeremiah Lee, Elbridge Gary, and the others, were the Basques Ventura Francisco Gomez de la Torre and Nicolas Carlos Villabasso, who should be mentioned before closing out this portion of the video for the record. On this screen is what's called the sacred cod in the Massachusetts State House, a symbol of the power of this industry in the state's founding. Now we must loop back down to the Basques located in the south, because Juan Morales and Luis de Onzaga would be the people to make sure the arms Diego de Gardoqui was getting ready in Spain could indeed arrive to the Americas, which they did, coming up through Louisiana, up the Mississippi, and other routes, with the help of the southern-based Basque businessmen, using, of course, that Venezuelan-linked Basque arms distributor shown before and quite unpronounceable, Real Compañía Guipuzcoana de Caracas. Also from the south, again, and which can't not be mentioned either, is what was discussed in the opening paragraphs, and that is Cuba and the Battle of Yorktown, though there were many, many other battles. Although Morales had already died at the time of Yorktown, again, this is the man who was associated with first bankers Oliver Pollock and Robert Morris, and credited with providing $40 million at one point and $300 million another, and who knows what else. But he was dead when George Washington needed reinforcements at Yorktown, and it was left to other Spanish and French, with a team of Spaniards in Cuba and French Admiral de Grasse at sea, to raise funds to pay for Washington's troops. And the people of Havana provided, according in part to a U.S. National Park Service website in the battle at Yorktown, about $6 million, and all in an afternoon. Here's a map courtesy of the Society of the Cincinnati, commemorating the Battle of Yorktown. The Spanish muskets shown earlier also came from them, as did the first map showing Canada and Massachusetts. And this image of Martha and George Washington is also courtesy of them, in which I place here as she is who took care of Morales at his death, and he is who presided over Morales' funeral. Incidentally, on a more light note, and something especially left out in history, more so than many of the other items presented perhaps, but Juan Morales' nephew, Pedro Casanave, another Basque born in Nevada, Spain, said to be a Mason, or maybe chief Mason for the city of Georgetown, what Washington, D.C. was called, laid the cornerstone for the White House on October 13, 1792. This image is also from the U.S. Library of Congress, and concerning the laying of the White House cornerstone. The Basques, the Spanish Basques, and the founders of the U.S. Revolution mixed constantly. Indeed, that lawyer, John Adams of Massachusetts, who defended the Marblehead fishermen in court, would later refer to the Basque fueros, a term for Spanish laws, in his papers on writing of the U.S. Constitution many years later, in 1787, in his publication called A Defense of the Constitutions of the Government of the United States of America. Although I am not an expert on Basques as a people by any stretch of the imagination, just forget it. But my understanding is they are a European people who never had slavery, never left out women in terms of inheriting the crown, their monarchy. They were a nation which always could have a queen as a ruler, and they even defeated Charlemagne in the year 778. This is quite a conclusion, as the same gentleman, the same lawyer, John Adams, who defended the Marblehead fisherman in court in the Pickpocket affair, is a signatory, one of three from the United States, on the document concluding the U.S. Revolution against the British. Here on the screen you see Article 10, but the third, after the first two being about always crucial national boundaries and sovereignty, the third was about fishing rights, extending for the United States up and into Newfoundland. This is where the Basques had been since at least the mid-1500s, working with the first peoples and later in New England too, starting in the 1600s. There in New England, the Basques worked in trade with the colonists. José de Gardoqui y hijos again Spanish for sons, with Diego de Gardoqui, as one might say leader, worked closely with the Marbleheaders and others, such as Misters Hooper, Lee, Cabot, and Garay. And now please see the credits. Thank you very much.